Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Theft in the Modern World, Supplier Cybersecurity Breaches, brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by apexanalytix. We have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. If you need any technical assistance, we first recommend refreshing your browser. If you continue to have technical questions or issues using the On24 platform, please use the Q&A box and I will respond as soon as I can. There will be no call-in number for today's session. To connect, you need to have access to either a computer, tablet, or cell phone audio. Everyone has been muted. So that you don't miss any shared content or an opportunity to share valued feedback with us, we recommend you enable pop-ups within your browser. If you happen to get disconnected, you can log on again using the instructions provided in your webinar confirmation email. If you continue to have trouble, please email webinars@iofm.com and we'll respond as soon as we can. For your convenience, everything in the webinar console is fully customizable, so you can move things around, resize the window, and even turn on captions for this event. At the bottom of your console, you will also find a resources box where you can download the slides as well as any additional content for today's presentation. Be prepared to answer 2 polling questions during the webinar. The polls will appear in the slide window during the presentation. Please choose from the multiple choice answers and hit submit. We'd love to have your participation and insight. And again, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A box. We'll do our best to leave time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as time allows. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and you'll receive a thank you email with the on-demand materials within 2 business days. And with that out of the way, I'd like to welcome our speakers for today. We'll hear from Ross Garrigan, Associate Partner at Darkbeam. Ross's background in communications helps businesses to share the importance of supplier cyber risk management with non-technical teams. He joined Darkbeam in 2022, prior to which his career included technology, media, and consumer goods marketing roles. We'll also hear from Matthew Morookian, Director of Marketing at apexanalytix. Matthew leads the development of product messaging and content for Apex's solutions. His favorite part of his job is working with clients to tell their stories for peers at trade shows and during virtual events. Prior to Apex, Matthew was responsible for client engagement and marketing for the IoT consulting firm 151 Advisors. He received his MBA at Baruch College. We'll also hear from Mark Brousseau, President of Brousseau and Associates. Over the past 30 years, Mark has established himself as a thought leader on accounts payable, accounts receivable, payments, and document automation. A popular speaker at industry conferences and on webinars and podcasts, Mark advises prominent end users and solutions and service providers on how to use automation to improve document and payment-driven business processes. Mark has chaired numerous educational conferences and has served on several industry committees and boards. He resides in Center City, Philadelphia with his wife and 3 sons. At this time, I would like to welcome our speakers and hand the webinar off to Matthew.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. I have a little bit of a raspy throat, but we'll get through this. Ross is talking through most of the session today. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about Apex. And we actually recently acquired Darkbeam. And I want to kind of tell the story of, why we acquired Darkbeam and who Apex is. Many of you may be familiar. We've been in business for about 35 years in the accounts payable recovery audit space. We have about 200 recovery audits going on at any time. Basically, we work with very large companies to find overpayments, duplicate payments that they've made to suppliers. And over the years, we've developed a supplier management portal for onboarding and ongoing risk management. We worked with a client about 10 years ago to develop it because this very large media client was utilizing multiple solutions and just couldn't get the configurability and the capabilities out of a solution. So we built it with them about 10 years ago, and we have over 100 global clients leveraging Apex Portal right now. And I started with the company about 5.5 years ago, And we had about 300 different data sources kind of feeding into this tool to validate tax IDs, bank account information, diversity status. Now you can look at some of the data points around the company. We have about 1,000 data sources. And the reason why we have that many data sources is because we're expanding the footprint that we're covering with more clients in different industries and different regions, and there's more risk. And something we've seen over the past 3-4 years is just risk within the supply chain, and your indirect spend is something that people like yourself are beginning to manage. It's becoming part of their responsibility. It might even be your whole role right now. And we've been working with Darkbeam as adding another capability of cybersecurity within our risk management platform. And in September, I think it was, we fully acquired Darkbeam because cybersecurity will help people create payment fraud events in your company or disruptions. Just today, there was a very large cable provider in the US that announced about 36 million customers' records were exposed. That was just today. And so this cybersecurity issue is just constant. And we wanted Ross to walk through, what is the landscape, who are the actors, and then, how are we, Darkbeam's capabilities in itself, and then also as part of Apex Portal, can support your efforts in making sure you're not paying any hackers or any fraudulent actors. So, this is a list of everything about Apex. You can go to our website and look at it all, or just reach out to me. I think, Ross, I'm going to hand it over to you. Here you go,
Thank
Ross.
you, Matthew. Thank you very much. And your voice survived. Congratulations. So hi, everyone. I don't know if you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. This won't drag on too long. It's 7:10 at the end of a very cold and wet day here in London. So we'll try and keep this interesting and not drag it out for too long. But what I really want to do is talk to you this evening or today, this afternoon, about a business risk, a risk that your organization faces today, yesterday, tomorrow, next week, from a financial and operational perspective. So when I'm talking about supplier cyber risk, which is what we're doing here, we are talking about this as a risk to your business, not a technical problem. This is not something that you just say, oh, well, IT are dealing with that, or InfoSec are dealing with that. This can cause serious costs, serious disruption, serious harm to your business. We're going to go through why. We'll have a quick look at the technical side of it and how cyber criminals attack your supply chain. And then we'll look at the impact that has on your business and your finances when a supplier is breached. You might be surprised at how large the impact is, or certainly how large the impact can be. You might certainly be surprised at just how prevalent these issues are. But we'll have a look critically at how you can manage these risks efficiently and at scale. And those two things, efficiency and scale, are really important, because obviously if it's going to cost you more to solve a problem than it does to live with it, then why wouldn't you just live with it? But actually, you can never fully remove this risk, in the same way as you can never fully remove any financial risk. But you can start to gain actionable and real oversight, which allows you to reduce that risk exposure. We'll talk about a few of the tools, systems, processes you can put in place to try and do that. But first, let's start at the very beginning. Cyber attacks and data breaches are the top threat to supply chains. On screen at the moment, we're showing that from some research by the Business Continuity Institute, but this is something we hear time and time again. It's something you've probably seen time and time again. Certainly if you've been to conferences at all in the last few years, certainly since COVID, when we've all gone back to doing them in person. And why is it a business risk? Well, because it has a very real impact. When one of your suppliers is breached, and don't forget, we're not talking about a hack, if you want to kind of use that term, against your company. We're talking about a cyber attack within your supply chain, whether that be someone disrupting supply, If a company you buy something from can no longer deliver to you, what's the impact on your organization? And don't forget, we're not even just talking about the supplier being attacked. What about the supplier's supplier? If they can't get the materials they need, what impact does that have on your organization? We'll have a look at that in a case study reasonably soon. What about the impact on your reputation? We can all think about stories we've read in the newspaper or we've seen on TV or we've read online about organizations who have suffered data breaches, who might not even necessarily have been breached themselves, but they've shared information with a supplier, maybe a payroll platform, an HR platform, whatever it might be, a marketing tool, which has then somehow been leaked. It's happened to me. Not at this organization, an organization I used to work for shared some information with a supplier. I got a letter through the post saying, "We're terribly sorry, Ross. Some of your data may well have ended up in the wrong hands." Then we look at the impact that could have from a regulatory standpoint, and crucially, the impact that could have from a financial perspective. What are the unexpected costs to your organization if one of your suppliers suffers a cybersecurity incident? Now, obviously, as you can imagine, those costs can start to mount up significantly. But with all of this in mind and such a serious risk, you might think, well, businesses must have this under control. We wouldn't surely allow a risk like this to run around unchecked. But as you may well know from your own organization, a lot of businesses don't have this under control. And we deal with organizations that are very large and that are very small and that are somewhere in between. And we consistently hear 4 reasons why organizations don't have cyber risks under control. Think about if any of these apply to you. Lack of time. Your procurement team, your risk team, your finance team, even your information security team just don't have the time to collate information, to process information, to reach out to suppliers to try and solve or reduce these risks. And then if they even did reach out to suppliers, would they receive that collaboration back? Because this is a two-way relationship and you need both organizations to be engaged in the outcome and engaged in the process. Perhaps you simply don't have the expertise in-house to be able to manage cyber risk in the supply chain. There's no shame in that. There's a shortage of cybersecurity expertise and your team are probably very busy protecting your own organization. And we'll have a look at that from an operational perspective fairly soon. And of course, it all boils down to budget, because even with a skills shortage, you can buy expertise if you've got the money. You can certainly buy time. Harder to buy collaboration, but there are incentives you can put in place. But if you don't have the budget, all of this feels impossible. It's not impossible, and we'll have a look at how you can start to look at these issues fairly soon. But let's get one thing clear. You might not be organized against supplier cyber risks, but your adversaries are. So before we look at the operational and financial impact on your organization, it might be handy to have a look at how the people attacking your suppliers actually go about their business. Now, when we think about cybercrime, there's a few images that pop into our head. We're going to deal with all those cliches, but the first one we'll start with is the dark web. Might be one of the first things you think of. Interestingly, whilst the dark web is used to communicate often between cyber criminals, it's not directly where the crime is happening, but it is an interesting place, and we'll have a look at it. So let's think about what we think of when we think of the internet. We think of Google, Amazon, Twitter, good things, things we use every day, things that are very valuable to us. But that's only about 4% of the internet. Most of the business tools you use, they exist on something called the deep web. That's parts of the internet that not everyone can access. But way below that, that remaining 6% of what is the internet, as we think of it, is the dark web. Now, the dark web is a good thing. It's where political journalism happens because you can remain anonymous, and it was created for that purpose. So if you live in a country where you can't express free political opinions, or journalism is not free and it's just a mouthpiece for the state, having a place where people can connect and act anonymously is a very good thing. Just discussions that you want to keep secret, that you want to be able to communicate with trust, happen on the dark web. As you can imagine, though, somewhere where people can go and be anonymous and do things anonymously inevitably is going to attract certain people as well. So although the dark web is fundamentally a good thing, it is also a place where the people attacking your suppliers and therefore fundamentally costing your business money choose to communicate. And why do they communicate there? Well, as we've just said, it's because they can stay anonymous. Because rather than their computer connecting to the internet provider and connecting to a website, there's a whole load of stages in between that keep you anonymous. This is very technical. If you want to ask technical questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. I suspect you don't want to. I suspect what you want to know is, what does this mean for my business? Because you're sat there now thinking about a hacker, and you're thinking about someone in a dark room with their hood up trying to take over the world. And while that person does exist, that's only one tiny part of what we're talking about when we talk about cybercrime. There could be a cyber criminal on this call right now taking part in this webinar. Now, they're probably not in a dark room with a hoodie on, although I am in a dark room in London, but not wearing a hoodie and not a cyber criminal. But they could be an insider within their own organization, that disillusioned employee who thinks they might make a bit of money by selling data. They might have been coerced by a bad actor into sharing a password or some access. They might exist within your organization. Now, chances are, if you're on this call, you're from a larger organization, you may well have systems in place. But how certain are you that all of your suppliers do? And when we're talking about financial impact on your organization, operational impact on your organization, you need to be pretty certain if you're not going to take it seriously. Then there are the career criminals. Essentially, these people work. It's their job to get into a business, to extort a business, to steal and sell data. This is what they do. Those are the people that we often see on the news. But also, of course, there are other countries, let's not name them, that might be trying to steal information for political gain or cause disruption to national infrastructure for political gain. And then, of course, there are those people who are just doing it because they think they can make the world a better place and they think that this is the way to do it. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about cybercrime, not these people actually on the screen right now. This is a stock image, but this is the industry that we're talking about when we talk about cybercrime. And industry is an important way of saying it, because just like your business exists within an ecosystem, you are somewhere within a supply chain, you buy something from someone, you do something to it, and you sell it to someone else. So do cyber criminals. When we look back at that rogues gallery there, we're not looking at an individual that's going to break into a system by getting into someone's email through a phishing link, that's going to install malicious software, that's going to download sensitive data, that's going to extort the organization, that's going to sell the data, that's going to launder that money. We're talking about an entire economy here. Just like it's very unlikely that your business starts with a raw material and finishes with an end product that it sells to an end consumer. So we have someone who might well be trying to attack your suppliers right now through a phishing email or something different, that's going to gain access and is going to sell that access in something called an access shop to someone who is going to use it to install malicious software and do all of those things we've just discussed. Now think about your industry and you and your competitors all working so hard to try and make money and to buy at the right price and to sell at the right price. All of that is happening in this cybercrime economy as we speak. And it could be happening to any one of your suppliers or multiples of your suppliers right now. Because what we're talking about here is relative risk. And as we know, because finance professionals on this call, we understand that risk can actually be boiled down to an equation. It's probability times impact. So how do we get there? Well, what's the vulnerability? What's the likelihood? And therefore the probability? And what will that do to my business? So we're going to talk about what it does to your business very soon. But that vulnerability times threat, that's difficult for an organization to work out within its supply chain. If we try and think of it in a simple analogy, if you leave your front door unlocked, your house is very vulnerable. But if you live on a deserted island, there's very little threat. There's very little likelihood of someone coming through your door. But actually, that is much harder to visualize among your suppliers. So some organizations try annual questionnaires, which by the way are good, and you should be doing that. Try annual questionnaires to try and get an idea of their organization's exposure. But of course, those questionnaires are entirely reliant on the person answering them, knowing the right answers and sharing the right answers. And there may be changes in between them. You should definitely be doing them, but you can also support them with things like continuous monitoring. And why? Because you've got a lot of suppliers, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 more suppliers. Any single one of them could have a vulnerability which is being exploited right now by cyber criminals. Because your large organization is probably secure. You've got that malware protection. You've got firewalls, you've got the right policies in place, you've got that security awareness training, but all it takes is one cyber criminal to get into one of your suppliers for you to have a very serious problem. Now, we're going to look at what those problems look like and the operational and financial impact very soon. And what we mean by that is, if a cyber criminal can get into one of your suppliers, what are they going to do? How is that actually going to impact your business? We're going to get there. But as we've started to see now, this is a serious business risk that your business needs to deal with. But chances are, statistically, it's probably not. So if you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to pass over to Matthew, and we can start to have a look at the first poll in this webinar.
Actually, I'll step in here, Ross, and brings us to our first poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. We want to know, does your procurement risk and/or finance team have visibility of supplier cyber risk levels? Do you have no visibility? Do you have manual risk questionnaires for some suppliers? Do you have manual risk questionnaires for all suppliers? Does your InfoSec team have automated monitoring for some or all suppliers, but other teams don't have access? Or does your procurement risk and finance team have visibility of supplier cyber risk monitoring? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we're going to discuss the results in just a moment. Ross, what's the biggest misperception among finance leaders when it comes to their cyber risks as it pertains to their supplier relationships?
I think there's two, and I think they kind of go hand in hand. I think the first is that we're talking about a technical problem. And because organizations have these very technical teams, these real experts in place, they think, oh, well, someone else must be dealing with this. And if we speak to information security teams every day, and they're just under so much pressure to protect their own organizations that realistically, they might not have the visibility they want of their supply chain. So that's the first one. And the second one is that it's therefore difficult for the rest of the business to manage. But actually, when you take a step back and you think of all the other risks that organizations are already managing among suppliers, ESG, credit risk, whatever it might be, there are systems that exist that allow you to at least get visibility of those risk levels. And the same applies for cyber risk. You can never completely remove it in the same way as you can never completely remove credit defaults among your suppliers, but you can start to get that control and at least start to understand your risk position. So I guess those are the two biggest misconceptions, that someone's already doing it and/or that actually it's just impossible. Neither is often true.
I reckon there's a finance professional listening in right now, shaking their head and saying, yeah, Ross, I've got enough on my plate. This isn't something I want to volunteer to lead. Why should a finance professional help lead the charge of solving this risk?
Because what we're talking about here is a risk to your business. And I know it sounds like a lot of work. We're going to talk about systems. And, I work for Darkbeam and we're acquired by apexanalytix. So I'm going to tell you there's a brilliant system there and there is a brilliant system there. But there are systems that exist that allow you to take control of this in a far less manual way than you're probably imagining. It doesn't mean whole teams of people sat in a tower block somewhere trying to control this risk for your business. But if we're going to start looking at some dollar amounts in the next section when we look at some case studies. When you start to see dollar values of risk against your business, you might start to wonder why you haven't already got it under control. Or if not under control, at least under measured.
And that's a perfect segue by something I was wondering about. How aware are CFOs, the finance leaders, to the risks involved in the supply chain? Do they recognize the problem?
Do they recognize the problem? I think so. And I think increasingly so, partly because, the news coverage of cyber attacks, data breaches is just so prominent. It's always there. So yeah, certainly I think they're aware. Are they aware of the solutions that are available? I think as an industry, we're getting there. I would like people to be more aware of the solutions generally, because this is a risk that can't be removed, but you can begin to manage it. You just need to know that.
And we'll try and do something about that in a few moments. But first, let's see how our attendees responded to our poll question. We asked you, does your procurement risk and or finance team have visibility of supplier cyber risk levels? 21% of you say you have no visibility into supplier cyber risk levels. Another 8% of you say you're using manual risk questionnaires for some of your suppliers. 14% of you said manual risk questionnaires for all of your suppliers. 1/4 of you say your InfoSec team has some visibility, and 1/3 of you say that you have visibility into supplier risk monitoring. What's your message to the 21% of our attendees today who say they have no visibility into their supplier cyber risk levels, Ross?
I mean, my clear message is you should. I understand why you don't, but you should. And it's possible. And we're going to look at how that's possible very soon.
What's the problem with these manual risk questionnaires?
Well, we'll start by saying you should be doing them. So whilst inherent problems exist, you should be doing them for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it promotes conversations with suppliers. Secondly, because it shows a governance paper trail. And thirdly, because it's just best practice. So you should be doing them.
I sense a but coming up.
Yeah, there's a bit of a but. And as with all things, it's somewhat subjective. But if you send a questionnaire to an individual within an organization, that questionnaire is going to be answered by a human. So you're entirely reliant on the human knowing the answer and being willing to answer honestly. Now, clearly there are questions you can put in there. Are you compliant to this particular standard? That's a good question to have because these standards can often be proven, i.e. you have to have a certificate or to be registered in some way. And that does mean there is a certain level of compliance. There's a certain level of security in place. But how confident are you as an organization that every single one of your suppliers that you share data with, let's start with data for now in this example, that every single one of your suppliers that you share data with would reach out to you the moment they found out they suffered a data breach? How confident are you? Because that could be your reputation on the line. And that's the problem with these manual risk questionnaires, is that you should be using them, but on their own, I'm personally not sure that you're going to get quite enough visibility there, quite enough consistent visibility there to actually really have a handle on your risk exposure.
It struck me that 1/4 of our attendees said that their InfoSec teams have visibility, at least there's monitoring into at least some of the suppliers. My question to you is, how hard is it to wrestle visibility outside of InfoSec and get that into the hands of procurement and finance as well? Is InfoSec willing to give that visibility up?
Yeah, and that's something that we tackle with some of our clients and some conversations that we have. I think it comes down to how you have that conversation, because actually what you need to do is support your InfoSec team because they're already under a lot of pressure. And in the unlikely event there's any information security professionals on here now, we deal with you every day. We understand the pressures you're under. When your procurement or finance team say, hey, we want to see this, they're not saying, hey, we don't trust you. They're saying, hey, let's collaborate. And in a business which is siloed in one way or another, there can be those competing forces of, hang on, this is our information. Why do you want to come over here? But actually, if you approach it in a collaborative way, everybody wins.
I imagine someone listening in right now is saying, well, this couldn't possibly happen to my organization. But Ross is going to walk you through an example that I think will have you shaking in your boots. Ross?
Yeah, thank you. And this is an example. I'm going to take you through 2 examples. There are millions of variations, probably more than billions of variations of how any one of these things can happen. But that only goes to show just how big a problem this is that we're facing. Okay, so let's imagine in this one scenario, a cyber criminal group targets one of your suppliers by exploiting vulnerabilities in their email system. That could be a phishing email. Maybe you've received a phishing email today. Maybe you've received one from your information security team pretending to be a phishing email today. But that could be all it takes. Someone then gets into the email system, can essentially lurk within an inbox, maybe because they got a password through a phishing email, or maybe because they were able to exploit some sort of software weakness. Now, those cyber criminals then intercept a legitimate invoice that was being sent from the supplier, and they're able to modify the bank account details to direct payments into another account, the account used by the cyber criminals. And they send that modified invoice to your organization, and your finance team pays it because everything looks legitimate. It's come from a trusted person, from a trusted organization. It looks like a real invoice. The wording is the same, and therefore the invoice is paid. That's fraud, right? But how long is it going to take you to detect that fraud? What if it's not detected until it's too late to chase down that money? What if it's detected straight away, but the money is already gone? Now, what we're talking about here, and by the way, this could be within one supplier. It doesn't need to start as a massive invoice. In fact, quite often it starts as smaller invoices, almost to test the water, to see if this can be gotten away with before the larger invoices start to roll in. So what we're talking about here is a form of business email compromise attack. They happen a lot in 2022 by some figures, and obviously it's very hard to measure. Let's not pretend this can be exact because you have to discover these things, they have to be reported, all of those things. We're talking about $2.7 billion in 2022. We're talking serious money just in this one kind of attack, one kind of fraudulent cyber attack within your supply chain. Think about how many suppliers you've got. Think about how secure all of those suppliers might be. Now, your organization feels unlikely is going to be susceptible to something like this because you're going to have all of those systems in place. You've got such a strong information security team, and actually you're less susceptible because you've got those systems in place. So you should certainly keep them. But how well do you trust that every single one of your suppliers has those in place, especially now we have that enormous price tag in place? But fraud isn't the only thing you need to worry about. Let's think about data. Now, you know what they say, data is the new oil. And why? Because it can be used for various things. Actually, if you can get the right kind of data, you can use that information to launch the next attack. But also, you can sell it, you can steal it. So let's think about sensitive information that your organization shares with its suppliers, maybe customer details, maybe employee details, maybe trade secrets. Now, who are you sharing these with? Is it software platforms that you use? Is it professional services firms that you use? Let's say a cyber criminal targets one of those suppliers and steals all or some of the data they hold, including yours. So that stolen data is either released publicly or it's advertised and sold on the dark web. That attracts media headlines. And that could be the first time you discover the breach when your organization's business name is out there in the news. But through the whole process, your internal systems have stayed secure because the cause and the impact are both outside of areas of your direct control. Now, when you start to bring third parties, business partners into this data breach event, suddenly the costs start to really rack up because not only have you got your own internal costs of investigating and responding, but there's all sorts of ancillary costs as well. What we're talking about here is a serious reputational problem, is a serious financial problem, and potentially could be a business critical event. So it takes 233 days to identify a compromise within your business partners, and they cost an average of $4.76 million. So we looked earlier at what the people on this call, what their businesses are already doing about these issues, and it was reassuring to see that actually a fair number of people on this call have got some visibility. We talked about those supplier questionnaires. We talked about the advantages they bring to organizations. They maintain that communication between you and your suppliers. They help you to confirm the adoption of accepted standards, and they help to establish a governance paper trail. But there are disadvantages as well. You're very reliant upon the supplier. They can be quite resource intensive depending on how they're implemented, and they can very quickly become outdated. We recommend you keep doing these annual supplier questionnaires. They are a good thing. But we also recommend you incorporate continuous oversight monitoring in two ways: through monitoring of vulnerabilities among your suppliers and through monitoring for events. Now, I work for Darkbeam, and Darkbeam was recently acquired by apexanalytix. And what our tool does is allows every week you to automatically analyze all of your suppliers for common vulnerabilities that cyber criminals might look for. And at the same time as that, be continuously monitoring the dark web, which we spoke about earlier, where that economy of cybercrime often communicates for people selling access to a system that maybe hasn't had information stolen from it yet, or from people selling stolen information. So you've got that visibility. So you can try and bring that time forward between something happening and you finding out. The quicker you know, the quicker you can respond, potentially the better position you can put your organization in. And all of this is available to you in an efficient and scalable way. On top of those questionnaires you're already doing, this continuous visibility. This is something we offer at Darkbeam. It's something which is incorporated into the Apex portal from apexanalytix. And I think Matthew is going to talk about some pricing that's actually in place this quarter, so there's not long left.
So it's the end of 2023. We have promotional pricing for Darkbeam, and what is it? What do we have? 12 days left in December. So if you're interested in it, just reach out, and we'll keep that pricing for you as part of attending this webinar or reaching out to us. But it's really straightforward. This is a easy list to see what you would obtain, and we can talk about it further at any point. But looking into 2024, I just want to highlight we have our conference in the U.S. Icon. It's going to be in April. It's really a Sunday to Tuesday. And we have a lot of great events like golf, days at the spa, and also a walking tour of San Antonio on Sundays, so you can network with your peers. And then we'll be doing sessions, group sessions. We have the rookie, Jim Morris, who will be speaking on Tuesday. Then we'll also be having sessions on how to leverage generative AI and risk management within your supply base. And the session that I really like the most is the breakout sessions. We have a theme called Let's Collaborate. And it really is practitioners leading a discussion with 20, 30 other practitioners. We have a great session every year called Let's Collaborate on Fraud, where a practitioner leads it and just discuss what fraud events have happened and how those could have been prevented. So it's really a practitioner-led event. And as of today, we just announced we're going to have a mini version of this in London on April 7th. And so if you go to our website later today, or maybe it's tomorrow, I'll give you a sneak peek. We'll be having a one-day event in London, and agenda and details on that should be on our website by tomorrow. But I think that's it. We'd love to answer any questions. And we do have just kind of a follow-up survey. If you're interested in any of these topics, please indicate so we can follow up appropriately.
And that brings us to the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you haven't already submitted your question for Ross or Matthew, or if you've thought of another question for Ross and Matthew, go ahead, use the Q&A tool on your screen to submit your question to me now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Ross, one of our attendees is wondering, so how easy is it to fix suppliers' cyber issues that you uncover?
If you collaborate with suppliers, it's certainly easier than if you don't. But, a lot of these kind of vulnerabilities, the common ways that cyber criminals get in, can be addressed. You're never going to have a zero risk organization, but let's say you use a tool like Darkbeam and you uncover a common vulnerability within a supplier. It's entirely possible they simply don't know, or someone thinks someone else has already done it. It certainly shouldn't make you think any less of them, because we're all humans. Businesses are collections of people. So just have that conversation and allow them to make those changes, or just to affirm to you, actually, we have made those changes, or we were aware of that, but we've got this in place. It is impossible to make your business risk-free, but it's certainly not impossible to reduce these risks.
Another attendee is wondering, so how often are you checking suppliers for vulnerabilities?
Within our platform, vulnerabilities is weekly. So any supplier that you enter into our platform and you put into what we call a watch list, or if you're accessing it through the Apex portal, every week they're going to be reassessed for common cybersecurity vulnerabilities. In some organizations, it's annual if you're using manual questionnaires. In some organizations, it's annual only for suppliers who are in the most material category or the highest risk category. In some organizations, it's never at all. But if you're using a tool like ours, then yeah, you're going to get that vulnerability monitoring weekly. And we talked about the dark web side of it as well. Here in London, we've got analysts actively checking every day. We have our own system that indexes areas of the dark web. So every day we're looking for those communications, people buying and selling access to your suppliers. So that's something that's being monitored essentially continuously.
And that brings us to another question from an attendee. So what happens when you find a supplier's information on the dark web?
When we find, we alert you. So you get a notification which will have been created for you by a human, by one of our analysts. So you might get a screenshot. You'll certainly get a written description of what it is they found and what the potential impact could be and who they think might be involved and all of those different things that you need to mount a response. But what should you do? Communicate. It really is that simple. Don't sit on it. Just communicate, because it may well be that you know about this before your supplier does, particularly if their systems didn't pick this up or they don't have this monitoring in place for themselves. So it's not just them that you're helping, it's your own organization as well. Communication really is key in this case.
Ross, a few moments ago, you mentioned the importance of collaborating with suppliers. Just how receptive are most suppliers to collaborating on issues around cybersecurity?
So there's two answers to that. The first is very, because it's in their business interest. The second is we're humans talking to humans. So in some ways it depends how you frame it. If you go in and say, aren't you terrible, you've done an awful thing, then imagine the response you're going to get. But these are supplier relationships, okay? So you wouldn't speak to a supplier like that in any other context. So just think about that relationship, think about collaboration, and generally speaking generally here, it's fine. Both businesses come out stronger.
One of our attendees is wondering, how does your solution compare to others on the market? What makes it different?
Yeah, okay. So we like to talk about speed, scale, scope, and service. Okay, so within Darkbeam, we like to help you very quickly gain an understanding of your supplier cyber risk exposure. We like to do that at scale, help you to monitor as many suppliers as possible. Now, it might be that you do genuinely have suppliers who are higher risk than others. And that's important to know, because that can help you in your response and what you do with this information. But having as much information as possible is really important. When we talk about scope, it's what kind of information have we got? Are we just looking at vulnerabilities, or are we also looking for incidents? Going back to that analogy earlier, are we just checking if the door's unlocked, or are we looking if anyone's walked in? And then service. We have created a tool which allows people in non-technical roles, or certainly helps to allow people in non-technical roles to understand supplier cyber risks. And we build a service around that. So we're not just giving you a login to a bit of software and telling you to go away and get on with it. We're trying to support you in whatever way that might be. That might just be email support. It might be email as a question and we'll answer it. Or it might be specific project support. It might be, we are going to have a 6-month project to address this area of cybersecurity risk in this part of our supply chain. Can you help us? And we'll help you with that. Or it might be our continuous embedded service, where our team essentially becomes an extension of your team, or somewhere in between those things. Fundamentally, though, we're not going to give you a password and walk away.
Matthew, I know that before acquiring Darkbeam, that apexanalytix offered a solution called First Strike Fraud Detect. How does Darkbeam interact with or play alongside First Strike?
Yeah, so we have many different solutions, but within Fraud Detect solution, Fraud Detect is really meant to identify fraud that is happening within your systems already. So it looks at 2 key categories of data. So first, it's looking at your vendor master, your supplier identity data. So looking against like an address. Is that address a home address, but you're doing $10 million with someone out of their home? Is it someone flagged in a prohibited list, or any characteristics about that supplier that might be a little bit suspicious? And then it also looks at transactional data. So it's looking at invoice numbers. Are they following a certain pattern? Is there a little, small invoice, and then a huge jump? Or some of these transactional pieces of data that you take a little bit here, and it kind of scores it up to, alert you should look into the supplier. Whereas we're talking about with Darkbeam, That's really looking at the web and those systems on the web and also the dark web. So fraud detectives were more meant to look at your data with that supplier to see if there's any suspicious suppliers that you should be talking to.
Ross, what's the thing that businesses do that unwittingly is leaving them vulnerable to fraud that they might not be thinking about, or to cyber attacks that they might not be thinking about?
Complacency. It really is around complacency. Since I now work for apexanalytix, since they acquired us, we get these. I'm sure your organization has them as well. Emails that come in that are essentially being sent by our technical team that look like phishing emails. The idea being that you report them. Because that comes in every time I get a suspicious looking email, I think, oh, hang on, what am I going to do with that? It removes that level of complacency. It's the same within all of your suppliers. But then what about your complacency around suppliers? What about, oh, the invoices come in, I'll pay it? What about, oh, do you know what, maybe they need that information, I'll share it with them? Complacency really is the enemy in this context. And I keep saying it because it's really important that people understand you cannot completely remove these risks, but you can start to reduce them and you can start to understand them. And if there's one thing you do, reduce that complacency, start to ask questions.
And Ross, there's really nothing on the horizon to suggest that these cyber risks are going to decline. It's only going to increase, right?
They're certainly not going to decline. Yeah, I mean, and there's geopolitical reasons for that as well that we don't need to delve too deeply into here. But this is an economy. Think about your industry. Think about your competitors, your sales team. Are they going to say, do you know what, we're not going to try quite as hard to make money now? Of course they're not, right? We're against, or you are against, your suppliers are against an industry of people trying to make money by stealing from and extorting companies. From a technical perspective, that's what cybercrime is, right? So yeah, sure, this is not going to go away. It's not going to decrease. Various parts of it will fluctuate. There might be more activism here and more fraud there, but the reality is this isn't going away.
And that will be our final word. Ross, Matthew, thank you so much for an excellent presentation and for sharing your insights with us today. And thank all of you for taking time out of your busy days to join us. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jovi. Ms. Jovi.
You, Mark. That is all the time we have for today's session. Before we close out, I do have a few brief housekeeping notes. If you could please fill out the short evaluation form that will appear on the webinar console. This will help us better serve your needs in future webinars. As a reminder, the on-demand materials will be emailed to everyone within 2 business days. This will include a PDF of the slides as well as a link to the recording of today's presentation. Thank you again to Ross, Matthew, and Mark. For a great presentation today, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. This webinar was brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by apexanalytix. Thank you all and have a great day.